The snow was falling gently outside my study window as I signed the final page, the fountain pen's ink still wet against the expensive parchment. December 24th, 8:47 a.m. The timestamp on the document would prove significant later. I sat down my pen and looked at the completed will, knowing that everything would change before the day was over. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, and at 73, I had built an empire that most people couldn't even comprehend. Blackwood Industries controlled shipping lanes across 3 continents, owned real estate in 12 countries, and held patents that generated millions in royalties annually. But sitting in my private study that Christmas Eve morning, I wasn't thinking about business. I was thinking about family, and how mine had shown their true colors over the past year. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my children and grandchildren downstairs prepared for what they thought would be a normal Christmas gathering, I had just executed the most devastating Christmas gift they would never see coming. The new will sitting before me would reshape, not just their futures, but their understanding of who had really been in control all along. Let me take you back to where this all began. Not this morning, but 11 months ago, when I first started noticing the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, the shared glances between my son Marcus and my daughter Victoria, the way my grandchildren suddenly became interested in my health and daily routines. Marcus, my eldest at 48, had always been the ambitious one. CEO of our family's charitable foundation, he lived in the sprawling estate next to mine, a gift I'd given him for his 40th birthday. What I didn't know then was that he'd been using the foundation's resources to fund his own investment ventures, carefully moving money through shell companies he thought I couldn't trace. My private investigators had been very thorough. Victoria, 3 years younger, had taken a different approach to exploitation. As the family's designated caretaker, a role she'd appointed herself to, she'd been systematically isolating me from old friends, convincing doctors that my memory was failing, and positioning herself as my primary decision-maker. Her husband, David, a personal injury lawyer with flexible ethics, had been researching conservatorship laws with uncomfortable enthusiasm. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot. To us! Now back to the story. Then there were the grandchildren. 22-year-old Madison, Marcus's daughter, who had been sweet-talking me while secretly dating a cocaine dealer she was planning to marry with my money. Her brother Trevor, 19, had been stealing from my wine collection, not the expensive bottles that would be missed, but the mid-range vintages that I might not notice. Clever, but not clever enough. Victoria's twin boys, both 25, had taken a more direct approach. They'd been coming to family dinners with their phones recording, trying to capture moments of confusion or forgetfulness they could later use as evidence of my mental decline. What they didn't realize was that my security system recorded everything in the house, including their whispered planning sessions in the guest bathroom. The final straw had come 3 weeks ago during our family Thanksgiving dinner. I'd been sitting in my chair, pretending to doze while they discussed their plans openly, assuming I couldn't hear them. The lawyers say we need documented proof of incompetence, David had whispered to Victoria as they stood near the fireplace. Memory lapses, confusion about dates, difficulty with basic tasks. She's sharp as ever, Marcus had replied, joining them with his 3rd glass of my aged whiskey. We need to be more creative. The medication switcheroo is working, Victoria had said, and my blood had run cold. Dr. Harrison thinks the increased confusion is natural progression. He's ready to sign the papers whenever we need them. That's when I'd realized they'd been tampering with my prescription medications, substituting mild sedatives and memory-affecting drugs to manufacture the symptoms they needed. The private pharmacy I'd been using had confirmed it. Victoria had been intercepting my prescriptions and having them filled with entirely different medications. But the conversation that had sealed their fate came next. "Once we get conservatorship, we liquidate everything," Marcus had continued. "Real estate first, then the business holdings. The art collection alone should net us $40 million. "What about Mother's charities?" Madison had asked, ever the concerned granddaughter. Marcus had laughed, actually laughed. "Screw the charities. This family has sacrificed enough for her causes. Time to take care of ourselves." That night, I'd called my estate lawyer, my private investigator, and my financial advisor. The game had changed, and they had no idea they were no longer the hunters, they were the prey. Over the following weeks, I'd played my role perfectly. I'd seemed more confused, more dependent, more willing to let them make decisions. Victoria had moved into the house temporarily to help with my care. Marcus had taken over more of my daily business oversight. The grandchildren had become suddenly suspiciously attentive. They thought they were closing in on their prize. What they didn't know was that I'd been 3 moves ahead from the moment I'd discovered their betrayal. The new will I'd just signed wasn't just a redistribution of wealth. It was a complete restructuring of power. Every charity I'd supported over the decades, every scholarship fund, every environmental initiative, every foundation fighting for causes they'd dismissed as bleeding heart nonsense, would receive portions of my estate. But the real masterpiece wasn't who was getting the money. It was who wasn't, and how they'd find out. I'd also been busy with other preparations. 3 months ago, I'd quietly transferred my most liquid assets into accounts they couldn't access. 2 months ago, I'd changed the ownership structure of Blackwood Industries, removing them from all leadership positions. Last month, I'd modified the trust funds I'd established for the grandchildren, adding moral character clauses that their recent behavior had already violated. The documentation was airtight. Photos of Trevor stealing wine, financial records of Marcus's embezzlement, medical records showing the prescription tampering, video evidence of their planning sessions, audio recordings of their conversations about liquidating my life's work. But I wasn't cruel. The will provided for their basic needs, modest trust funds that would ensure they'd never be destitute, but would never again live in the luxury they'd taken for granted. The real punishment wasn't poverty. It was the loss of the power and status they'd assumed was their birthright. I heard voices in the hallway outside my study, Victoria's concerned tone, Marcus's authoritative responses, the excited chatter of grandchildren who thought Christmas morning would bring them one step closer to their inheritance. They had no idea that Christmas Eve had already sealed their fate. Standing up from my desk, I locked the will in my private safe, the one they didn't know existed, hidden behind a false panel in my bookshelf. By this evening, when they finally showed their true colors completely, it would be too late for them to change course. My phone buzzed with a text from my investigator. "Family meeting recording equipment is active. All evidence is being documented. In real time. Legal team standing by." Perfect. They'd chosen Christmas Eve for their final play, probably thinking the holiday setting would make me more emotional, more malleable. They were about to discover that the woman they'd been underestimating had been manipulating far more powerful people than them for over 50 years. I smoothed my cashmere sweater and checked my appearance in the mirror. The frail, confused old woman they expected to see would make her appearance shortly. But first, I had one more preparation to make. I opened my laptop and sent a carefully crafted email to my estate lawyer, my accountant, and 3 members of my board of directors. The message was simple. If you're reading this, the events we discussed have unfolded as predicted. Please execute Protocol Christmas as outlined in our previous meetings. Protocol Christmas. Even the name had a certain poetic justice to it. Knock at my study door interrupted my thoughts. "Grandmother?" Madison's sweet voice called out. "Are you all right in there? We're starting to worry." I smiled, saving the laptop and closing it carefully. The performance was about to begin, and I'd had months to perfect my role. "Coming, dear," I called back, adding just a touch of confusion to my voice. What was I doing? Oh yes, looking at old photos. I opened the door to find Madison standing there with her most concerned granddaughter expression, the same one she'd been practicing for months. "You look tired, grandmother. Maybe you should rest before dinner." "Perhaps you're right," I agreed, playing into their narrative perfectly. "I do feel a bit scattered today. So many people in the house, so much excitement." Madison's eyes lit up with satisfaction. Another piece of evidence for their incompetence file. "Let me help you to your room," she offered, taking my arm with just a bit too much enthusiasm. As we walked down the hallway, I could see Marcus and Victoria in the living room, their heads together over some documents. Probably the conservatorship papers they'd been preparing, waiting for the right moment to present them. They'd chosen tonight, Christmas Eve, for maximum emotional impact. The irony was delicious. They thought they were giving themselves the gift of my fortune, but I'd already wrapped up their true present that morning. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times. In just a few hours, when Christmas dinner was served and the family was gathered around my table, eating my food and drinking my wine while plotting my downfall, they'd finally make their move, and I'd be ready for them. But first, I had a role to play. The confused, dependent elderly woman they needed me to be. The woman whose medications had been making her increasingly compliant and uncertain. The woman who would surely agree to whatever papers they presented, especially on Christmas Eve, especially surrounded by family who claimed to love her. They had no idea that every dose of their substitute medications had been replaced with harmless vitamins months ago, that every confused moment had been carefully calculated, that every sign of weakness had been strategic positioning. The game was nearly over, and they still thought they were winning. As Madison helped me toward my bedroom, chattering about Christmas dinner preparations, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't frail or confused. She was sharp, calculating, and about to teach her family the most expensive lesson of their lives. After all, I hadn't built a business empire by being the gentle grandmother they thought they could manipulate. I'd built it by being smarter, more ruthless, and infinitely more patient than anyone who dared to underestimate me. Tonight, they'd discover exactly who Eleanor Blackwood really was. And tomorrow, they'd wake up to a very different world than the one they'd gone to sleep expecting to inherit. The house felt different as afternoon descended into evening. The Christmas decorations that had seemed festive that morning now felt like stage props in an elaborate theater production. Every twinkling light, every carefully placed ornament, every strand of garland served to mask the predatory tension that had been building for months. I sat in the living room's wingback chair, the one they'd designated as grandmother's spot, positioned perfectly for them to monitor my every movement while appearing attentive. Victoria bustled around me, adjusting my blanket, offering tea, playing the devoted daughter with Academy Award precision. "Mother, you seem tired," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of artificial concern she'd perfected. "Perhaps we should postpone some of the evening's activities." The evening's activities. What a delicate way to phrase their planned ambush. Marcus appeared from the direction of my study, and I noticed he was carrying a leather portfolio. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral, slightly vacant. The portfolio undoubtedly contained the conservatorship papers they'd been preparing. "The weather's getting worse," he announced, though I could see through the windows that the snowfall was actually quite gentle. "I think it's best if everyone stays here tonight. No sense risking the drive home in these conditions." Of course, they needed witnesses for whatever they were planning, and they needed to ensure no one could leave once their scheme was in motion. David was already settling into the couch with his laptop, probably reviewing legal precedents. The grandchildren were scattered throughout the room, their phones nowhere to be seen. Unusual for them, but telling. "That's wonderful," I said, injecting a note of genuine pleasure into my voice. "A real family Christmas. It's been so long since we were all together like this." Victoria and Marcus exchanged one of their looks, the kind they thought I couldn't see or interpret. But I'd been reading people's intentions for decades before they were born. "Grandmother," Madison approached with that bright smile that no longer fooled me. "We were hoping we could talk to you about some family matters after dinner. Nothing urgent, just some paperwork that needs your attention." Paperwork. The understatement of the century. "Of course, dear. Though I do hope it's nothing too complicated. My mind isn't as sharp as it once was, you know." I let my voice trail off slightly, as if losing focus. Trevor, who'd been suspiciously quiet, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should record the conversation. You know, so there's no confusion later about what was discussed." "Excellent idea," David said, not looking up from his laptop. Always good to have everything documented. They were positioning all their pieces, setting up their perfect scenario. What they didn't know was that I'd been positioning my own pieces for months, and tonight's performance would be the culmination of careful planning that would make their amateur hour look pathetic. My phone, tucked discreetly in my cardigan pocket, buzzed with a text. My estate lawyer confirming that all backup documentation had been filed with the appropriate courts. If anything happened to me tonight, if they tried to have me committed, if there was any question about my mental state, there were multiple safeguards in place. "Mrs. Blackwood," David finally looked up, his expression the picture of professional concern. "I've been reviewing some legal matters that might be relevant to your situation. Would you mind if we discussed them later this evening?" My situation. As if my decades of business acumen and financial success were a medical condition requiring intervention. "I suppose," I replied, adding a note of uncertainty that made Victoria reach over and pat my hand reassuringly. The afternoon crept by with painful slowness. They were all so obviously on edge, checking their phones, whispering in corners, their excitement barely contained. It reminded me of children on Christmas morning, unable to wait for presents, except their present was my complete financial destruction. At 4 o'clock, I excused myself to freshen up before dinner. In my bedroom, I checked the secure phone my private investigator had given me. 3 new messages confirmed that everything was proceeding according to plan. The media contacts were standing by. The legal team was in position. My business partners had been briefed and were prepared for the transition. But the message that made me smile was from an unexpected source. My housekeeper Maria, who'd worked for the family for 15 years. "Mrs. B, I heard them talking in the kitchen. They think you don't know what day it is. They're planning something big tonight. I recorded everything on my phone. Whatever you need, I'm here." Maria had been watching this unfold with growing disgust. She'd seen how they treated me when they thought no one was looking, heard their conversations when they assumed she didn't speak enough English to understand their schemes. Her loyalty would prove invaluable. I texted her back, "Thank you, Maria. Please make sure you're available tonight around 8 p.m. There might be some excitement." By 5:30, the aroma of Christmas dinner was filling the house. Maria had outdone herself, prime rib, roasted vegetables, all the traditional fixings. It would be my last meal as the woman my family thought they could manipulate, and I intended to savor every bite. As we gathered around the dining room table, I took a moment to observe my family. Really observe them. Marcus at the head of the table opposite me, playing the role of family patriarch. Victoria to my right, her hand resting protectively on my shoulder. The grandchildren scattered around, their phones finally making an appearance, undoubtedly to document my behavior for their evidence file. The conversation during dinner was almost surreal in its artificial normalcy. They asked about my health, my comfort, my plans for the new year, all while I could practically feel the predatory energy radiating from them. Grandmother, Trevor said between bites of Maria's excellent roast, I was thinking about that story you told us about starting your business. How you began with just a small loan and built everything from nothing. I smiled, genuinely this time. Oh, that takes me back. I was barely 25, and the bank president told me that women weren't suited for business. Said I should find a nice husband and leave the thinking to men. What did you do? Madison asked, and for just a moment, I caught a glimpse of genuine curiosity in her eyes. I bought his bank, I replied simply. It took me 3 years, but I bought his bank, and then I had the pleasure of firing him personally. The table fell silent. Even after all these years, they still didn't quite grasp the scope of what I'd built, or the ruthless determination it had required. That's quite a story, David said carefully. Oh, that was just the beginning, I continued, warming to the theme. You see, I learned early that people will underestimate you if you let them, and sometimes, letting them underestimate you is the greatest advantage you can have. Another exchange of glances around the table. They were wondering if there was hidden meaning in my words, but they were too committed to their plan to reconsider. Now. By 7:30, dinner was finished and we'd moved back to the living room. The Christmas tree dominated one corner, its lights casting dancing shadows on the walls. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful, festive, warm. Instead, it felt like a spotlight illuminating a stage set for betrayal. Mother, Marcus began, settling into the chair closest to mine. We need to discuss some important matters about your future, your care, your finances. Here it comes, I thought, keeping my expression neutral but attentive. Victoria moved to my other side, the leather portfolio David had been carrying now in her hands. We've all been worried about you lately. The confusion, the memory lapses, the difficulty managing daily tasks. I blinked slowly, as if trying to process what she was saying. I have been feeling scattered lately. We know. And that's perfectly normal at your age, David said, his lawyer voice in full effect. But we think it's time to make some arrangements to ensure you're properly cared for. The grandchildren had formed a semicircle around my chair, their phones discreetly positioned to record everything. They thought they were documenting my incompetence. Instead, they were creating evidence of their conspiracy. What kind of arrangements? I asked, letting a note of anxiety creep into my voice. Marcus pulled out the first document. This is a power of attorney agreement. It would allow Victoria and me to help manage your affairs, take care of the complicated financial decisions, make sure all your needs are met. I stared at the document, pretending to struggle with understanding it. But I've always managed my own affairs. And you've done wonderfully, Victoria said in that patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. But things are getting more complex, and we don't want you to be burdened with all these details. There's also this, David added, producing another set of papers. A medical directive that would allow us to make healthcare decisions if you're unable to do so yourself. And this, Marcus continued, laying out a third document, is a modification to your existing will. It streamlines everything, makes the distribution of assets more efficient. I looked at the papers spread before me, my heart racing not with confusion, but with anticipation. They'd just laid out their entire scheme, documented their attempt to strip me of every legal right, recorded their conspiracy to steal my life's work. This is all very overwhelming, I said, my voice trembling slightly. So many papers, so many decisions. We know, Mother, Victoria said, her hand on my shoulder tightening slightly. That's why we're here to help. All you need to do is sign, and we'll take care of everything else. The moment of truth had arrived. They were asking me to sign away my autonomy, my wealth, my legacy, everything I'd spent 7 decades building. They were so confident in their manipulation that they couldn't see the trap they'd walked into. I picked up the pen they'd placed before me, watching as they all leaned forward slightly, anticipation radiating from them like heat from a fire. Before I sign, I said slowly, I want to make sure I understand. This power of attorney, it means you make all my financial decisions? That's right, Marcus confirmed. No more worrying about investments or business decisions or any of that complicated stuff. And the medical directive means you decide. My health care? Only if you're unable to make those decisions yourself, Victoria assured me. Which, given your recent episodes of confusion, and the will modification, just simplifies the distribution process, David jumped in, makes everything more tax efficient. I nodded slowly, as if absorbing this information. Around me, I could feel their collective held breath, their barely contained excitement. Well, I said finally, I suppose if you all think it's best. I touched the pen to the first document, then paused. Though I do have one question. Of course, Mother. What is it? I looked up at Marcus, then at Victoria, then let my gaze sweep across my grandchildren. When I spoke again, my voice was no longer uncertain, no longer confused. It was the voice that had commanded boardrooms, negotiated million-dollar deals, and built an empire. My question is this. Did you really think I was stupid enough to fall for this pathetic amateur hour? The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the soft crackling of the fireplace and the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I don't understand, Victoria stammered, but her face had gone pale. Oh, I think you understand perfectly, I replied, setting down the pen and leaning back in my chair. The question is, what did you think would happen next? The grandfather clock struck 8 as the weight of my words settled over the room like a blanket of ice. 5 faces stared at me in various stages of shock, denial, and dawning horror. The Christmas tree lights continued their cheerful blinking, a mockery of the season's supposed joy and family togetherness. Marcus was the first to recover, his face flushing red as he leaned forward. Mother, you're confused. We're trying to help you. Help me? I stood up slowly, no longer the frail woman they'd been manipulating. The way you helped me by switching my medications, the way you helped by recording my private moments, the way you helped by planning to liquidate my life's work for your own benefit. Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her hand still clutching the leather portfolio as if it were a lifeline. I have to say, I continued, walking to the fireplace mantel where I'd placed a small wrapped box earlier that day. Your plan was reasonably well thought out. The medication substitution to create symptoms of dementia was particularly creative. Dr. Harrison was quite concerned about my cognitive decline. We don't know what you're talking about, David interjected, but his lawyer's composure was cracking. Of course you don't. I picked up the wrapped box, turning it over in my hands. Just like you don't know about the shell companies Marcus has been using to embezzle from the charitable foundation. Just like you don't know about Victoria's plans to have me committed to Shady Oaks once the conservatorship was in place. Just like you don't know about the cocaine dealer Madison thinks she's going to marry with my money. Madison gasped, her face going white. How did I know? I smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Because while you were all so busy treating me like a doddering old fool, I was doing what I've done for 50 years in business. Staying 3 steps ahead of people who think they're smarter than me. I began unwrapping the small box with deliberate slowness, enjoying the way their eyes followed my movements. You see, children, there's something you never understood about. Your old grandmother. I didn't build Blackwood Industries by being weak or trusting or easily manipulated. I built it by being more ruthless than anyone who tried to destroy me. The box revealed a small digital recorder. I pressed play. Victoria's voice filled the room. The medication switcheroo is working. Dr. Harrison thinks the increased confusion is natural progression. Then Marcus, once we get conservatorship, we liquidate everything. Real estate first, then the business holdings. The color drained from their faces as their own words condemned them. But I wasn't finished. That's just one of many recordings, I said, setting the device on the mantel. I have security footage of Trevor stealing from my wine cellar, financial records of Marcus's embezzlement, medical documentation of the prescription fraud, and, my personal favorite, video of you discussing this entire scheme in my guest bathroom last month. Trevor was shaking now, his youthful arrogance completely evaporated. Grandmother, we can explain. Explain what? How you've spent months manufacturing evidence of my incompetence? How you've been poisoning me with unauthorized medications? How you plan to steal everything I've worked for and then discard? Me in a nursing home? The twins hadn't said a word, but I could see them calculating, trying to figure out how much trouble they were in. But here's what you really don't understand, I continued, moving to my chair and opening a folder I'd placed there earlier. This morning at 8:47 a.m., I signed a new will. Would you like to know what's in it? The silence was deafening. Even the fire seemed to crackle more quietly. The Blackwood Foundation for Educational Excellence will receive 40% of my estate. The Environmental Protection Fund gets 20%. The Women in Business Initiative gets 15%. Various other charities that I've supported over the years will receive the remainder of my liquid assets. What about us? Victoria whispered. You? I pretended to consider this. Oh yes, you're provided for. Each of you will receive a trust fund of exactly $50,000, enough to ensure you're not destitute, but not nearly enough to maintain the lifestyle you've grown accustomed to on my dime. Marcus shot to his feet. You can't do this. We're your family. Family? I laughed, and the sound was sharp as breaking glass. Family doesn't drug their elderly relatives. Family doesn't plan to steal their life's work. Family doesn't conspire to have their grandmother declared incompetent and locked away. We'll contest it, David said, his lawyer instincts finally kicking in. Undue influence, mental incompetence. With what evidence? I pulled out another folder. The medical records showing you've been giving me unauthorized medications? The recordings of you discussing your conspiracy? The financial documents proving embezzlement? Please, David, enlighten me about which part of your case you think would hold up in court. I walked to the window, looking out at the gentle snowfall. But that's not even the best part. You see, I've also made some other changes. The house you live in, Marcus? The one I gave you? The deed was always in my name. As of this morning, it belongs to the foundation. You have 30 days to vacate. Marcus sank back into his chair as if I'd struck him. Victoria, your position as director of my medical decisions, revoked. Your access to my financial accounts, terminated. Your key to this house? Well, we'll be changing the locks tonight. And the grandchildren, I continued, turning back to face them. Those trust funds I established for your education and futures, there were moral character clauses in the agreements, clauses that your recent behavior has comprehensively violated. Madison was crying now, though whether from shame or loss of her cocaine dealer wedding fund I couldn't say. But Mother, Victoria tried one last time, surely we can work something out. We're sorry, we made mistakes. Mistakes? I moved closer to her, and she actually flinched. Poisoning someone isn't a mistake, Victoria. It's a felony. Embezzlement isn't a mistake, Marcus. It's theft. Conspiracy to commit fraud isn't a mistake. It's a crime that carries serious prison time. The room fell silent again as the weight of their legal jeopardy settled over them. However, I said, returning to my chair, I'm not entirely without mercy. The district attorney is a personal friend of mine, and I could be persuaded not to file criminal charges under certain conditions. What conditions? David asked, though he looked like he was afraid to hear the answer. First, Marcus will resign from the foundation and make full restitution for every penny he's stolen. Second, Victoria will surrender all medical and financial, authority she's claimed over me and publicly acknowledge her abuse. Third, all of you will sign agreements never to contact me again, never to challenge my will, and never to use the Blackwood name in any business dealings. And if we don't agree? Marcus asked through gritted teeth. I smiled. Then I'll have the pleasure of watching you all go to prison for elder abuse, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Your choice. Maria appeared in the doorway as if on cue. Mrs. Blackwood, should I call the car service? I believe your guests will be leaving shortly. Thank you, Maria. And please prepare the guest room locks to be changed first thing tomorrow. David was frantically typing on his phone, probably trying to research whether my legal threats had merit. Let him research. I'd had months to prepare with the best legal minds money could buy. There is one more thing, I said, reaching into my final folder. Since you were all so interested in recording tonight's events for evidence, I thought you should know. Everything that's happened here tonight has been live-streamed to my legal team, my estate executor, and several members of my board of directors. Your conspiracy, your admissions, your attempts at manipulation, it's all been documented by multiple witnesses. Victoria looked around the room wildly, finally noticing the small cameras I'd had installed in every corner. So you see, I concluded, not only have you lost your inheritance and your access to my wealth, but you've also provided ironclad evidence of your own criminal behavior. In business, we call that a complete strategic failure. Marcus stood up slowly, his face a mask of defeated rage. This isn't over. Oh, but it is, I replied calmly. It's been over since the moment you decided to treat me like a victim instead of the woman who built everything you've been trying to steal. One by one, they began to leave. The grandchildren first, skulking out like beaten animals. David, clutching his laptop and muttering about appeals. Victoria, casting desperate looks, back at me as if hoping for some last-minute reprieve. Marcus was the last to go. At the doorway, he turned back one final time. I want you to know, he said, his voice shaking with fury, that you've destroyed this family tonight. No, Marcus, I replied softly. You destroyed this family the moment you decided my love wasn't enough, that you needed my money too. I just chose not to be a victim of your greed. After they left, Maria and I stood in the suddenly peaceful living room. The Christmas tree still twinkled, the fire still crackled warmly, but the house felt completely different, cleaner, somehow. Will you be all right, Mrs. B? Maria asked, beginning to clear away the abandoned legal documents. I'll be fine, Maria. Better than fine, actually. I walked to the window, watching the last of their cars disappear into the snowy night. For the first time in months, I feel like myself again. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the day's events. Yes, I'd lost my family, but had they ever really been my family, or just parasites feeding off my success? The organizations that would benefit from my estate would use the money to educate children, protect the environment, support women in business, causes that would outlive me and create positive change in the world. The next morning was Christmas Day, and for the first time in years, I woke up truly at peace. The snow had stopped, leaving the world outside clean and white and full of possibilities. Maria brought me coffee and the morning papers. The business section had a small item about changes in the Blackwood Foundation leadership. By tomorrow, there would be more stories as the legal proceedings began and the full scope of their conspiracy became public. My phone rang. My estate lawyer, calling to confirm that all the documentation from the night before had been properly filed and witnessed. Mrs. Blackwood, he said, I have to say, in 30 years of practice, I've never seen a more thoroughly documented case of attempted elder abuse. Your evidence is absolutely airtight. Thank you, Richard. And the criminal referrals? Filed this morning. The district attorney's office will be very interested in the prescription fraud alone. After hanging up, I sat in my study, looking out at the winter landscape. Somewhere out there, 5 people were waking up to discover that their lives had fundamentally changed. Their schemes had not only failed spectacularly, but had also exposed them to serious legal consequences. But I wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. I was thinking about the future, about the scholarships that would be funded, the environmental projects that would be supported, the women entrepreneurs who would receive the backing they needed to build their own empires. I'd spent Christmas Eve teaching my family that actions have consequences. But Christmas Day was about something more important, ensuring that my life's work would continue to create positive change long after I was gone. The last laugh, as it turned out, belonged not to the greedy children who thought they could manipulate a vulnerable old woman, but to the woman who had built an empire by never underestimating her opponents, and never letting anyone underestimate her. After all, the best Christmas gift isn't the one you receive, it's the one that keeps giving. Long after the wrapping paper has been cleared away, up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.